Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Again our today's session is a continuation of part 1 of the novel Great Expectations, and we would do chapter 13 to 19 in today's session. Before I continue with what we are going to do in our today's session, a quick review of the previous session. Well, our previous session was also a continuation of part 1. As you know by now that there are 19 chapters in part 1 of Great Expectations. We divided this, actually I divided it for you into 3 parts further. So chapters 1 to 7 were covered in a session, and then in the previous session from chapters 18 to 12 were covered. We had long detailed explanation and critical analysis of these chapters. I read a lot of text for you and critically analyzed the use of symbols and images and tried to share with you how different characters were introduced and how they developed. So we also looked at how different themes were explored and how these themes were incorporated in the text that was given from chapters 8 to 12. Now we come to our today's session. As I have said earlier, it is a continuation of part 1. From chapter 13 to 19 will be covered in today's session. The question arises, how we are going to explore all this? Well, we would follow the same scheme, that is, we would look at some important happenings of each chapter, which would lead us to look at some relevant parts of the text if necessary, and I would try to relate important themes to the happenings that are mentioned in those chapters and to the narration that is given in the specific selected parts of the text. We would look at the development of the characters, and by the end of today's session, inshallah, we would be able to finish part 1 of Great Expectations. With this we come to chapter 12 of part 1. Let's see what happens in this chapter. Pip returns once again to Miss Havisham's. He is afraid that he will be punished for fighting. Remember, in the previous chapter he had a fight with a pale man in the garden. But the accident goes unmentioned during his next visit to Miss Havisham's, and he also does not see the boy again. Every time he goes there, he performs the duty of pushing the wheelchair of Miss Havisham's from her room to the large banquet hall. Thus, over a long period of months, he continues doing the same. What we notice is as if he is becoming a part of that dull, dismal, gloomy, dark setup of Miss Havisham's house. These visits continue for 8 to 10 months as he goes there every alternate day. Continuing with chapter 12, I would say that Pip is becoming increasingly hopeful that Miss Havisham intends to raise him from his low social status or standing and give him a gentleman's fortune. Lost in his false hopes, he cannot notice that Miss Havisham actually encourages Estella to torture him and asking him to break his heart. If you can remember the previous chapters that we discussed in the previous session, we saw Miss Havisham giving order to Estella when she says that she doesn't want to play with this coarse laboring boy. Miss Havisham gives the order to play with him and actually to break his heart. During the same time, Mr. Pumblechook frequently visits Mrs. Joe and discusses Pip would have better chances of making his future if he keeps on seeing Miss Havisham. But the prospects seem to be completely destroyed as one night Miss Havisham asks Pip to bring Joe to visit her in order that Pip may start his apprenticeship as a blacksmith. As she offers to help with the papers that would officially make Pip Joe's apprentice, Pip realizes that she never meant to make him a gentleman, and his expectations about great future are not fulfilled. This chapter is important with reference to the emergence and continuation of some themes. Themes in the so far discussed text and chapters lead us towards understanding that the theme of social uplift is one of the important themes of Dickens' works. So in terms of the theme of upward social lift, what we notice is Pip's asking Biddy to tutor him shows his sheer determination to rise above his coarseness and shame. If you remember, Estella made fun of him, tortured him, and was being rude towards him, saying that he had coarse hands. Already he is turning into a snob who always thinks himself superior and considers his own interests only. When he tells Biddy about Estella, he fails to notice the intense interest she has in him. She is below his aspirations, so he does not notice her as a person. However, when it comes to gaining his own benefit, he is ready to use her as a tool to gain education. Abhi hame what we need to notice is that Pip is a very, very selfish boy. Biddy likes Pip. Pip does not notice this. Why he does not notice this? Because he is not interested in Biddy. But what he wants Biddy to do is to educate him. For his personal benefit, he is ready to use her as a tool. Theme of guilt, terror and secrecy. These themes continue throughout the chapter. This is what we have noticed. Pip fears that he may be arrested after fighting with that pale young gentleman, and this shows his terror as well as guilt. In the previous chapters, you noticed his guilt and his terror related to seeing the man who was maybe sent by the convict, that is Pip, gave the file of Joe. Now what we notice is that Pip again is frightened, and this time the source of all this fear is that he had a fight with this pale yellow man in the garden, and now he is guilty about that, and he's also frightened. He is terrified that when next time he would go to Miss Havisham's place, he would be asked about that and he would be criticized about that. However, it does not happen so. As far as the theme of secrecy is concerned, Pip never told Joe about the convict, and currently he has told Joe nothing of Miss Havisham or even his fight with the young man. He does not tell anything to anybody. He has a number of secrets that he keeps with himself. When it comes to the art of characterization of Charles Dickens, I would say Dickens as a social satirist and as a novelist shows his mastery, especially through the previous few chapters that we did in the previous session and this chapter that we have just done. Satire on relations through parasitic relatives such as Miss Havisham's relatives, that include Sarah Pocket, Camilla and Mr. Raymond and Georgina. These all things show Dickens' art of characterization. Satire carries the tinge of humor as well when Dickens often calls Raymond Mr. Camilla in the previous chapters, mocking him as a henpecked husband at the mercy of his wife. Over concern of these relatives, their entire interest and their inner desire to have share in Miss Havisham's wealth, her taunting style, all is a bitter criticism on the society. And now it again becomes ironic when Pip, with all his expectations, what we notice again is expecting something from Miss Havisham. All the relatives of Miss Havisham can be compared to vultures waiting for her to die so they can collect her money. The question arises, what is the role of Pip? Is he too a vulture who wants some meat, his due share out of all that? Why is he looking up to Miss Havisham? What does he want Miss Havisham to do for him? Is he being selfish in doing that? These are the questions that are very, very important at this stage. Dickens' descriptions are superb in adding to their distasteful personalities, that is of the relatives. He paints the picture of each character. He sketches it in a wonderful way. He paints Sarah Pocket as a little dry, brown, corrugated old woman with a small face that might have been made of walnut shells and a large mouth like a cat's without the whiskers. Sarah's character tag becomes the walnut shell countenance, the phrase that repeats throughout the book. And again, what we notice is that Dickens uses these descriptions and these tags for the characters that he carries throughout the novel to create the image of these characters as certain kinds of personalities. Pip's personality as well is presented by Dickens. We see him growing, we see him from an innocent, frightened boy turning gradually and slowly into a boy who is more snob and who is more selfish now. And the art of characterization of Dickens is that we can almost visualize this change that comes. Another important theme that emerges is the theme of revenge. Miss Havisham continues to operate for her agenda of revenge, and she uses Estella as a tool for her purpose. She keeps on insisting Estella to break hearts, to break the heart of people around, to break the heart of Pip. And in doing so, I would say she is trying to take revenge from all the men for whatsoever happened to her. Well, there is some autobiographical element in the novel as well. Not only social commentaries are evident, but also Dickens' personal experience as a child is reflected. Just as Dickens' mother wanted him to keep working to bring in money, we notice that Mrs. Joe is hoping to get some financial gain from Pip's stay with Miss Havisham. And Dickens satirizes the greed of parents who benefit at their children's expense. This leads us to chapter 13, and let's quickly see what happens in chapter 13 of part 1. Joe accompanies Pip to the satyr's house the next day to complete the papers of Pip's apprenticeship. With his rough speech and crude appearance, he seems horribly out of place in the Gothic mansion. Miss Havisham gives Joe 25 guineas for Pip's service to her and thus buys Pip's indenture as a blacksmith. Returning to Mr. Pumblechook's house, where Mrs. Joe is also anxiously waiting, Joe produces the 25 pounds, much to everyone's except Pip's joy. So it is only Pip who is not happy with this. The rest of the people are happy with this money. Caught up in the excitement, Mr. Pumblechook insists that Pip be legally bound by law and drags Pip and the entourage down to the town hall to be bound. Mrs. Joe then brings everyone out for dinner. At the meal, all seem to be enjoying themselves, but Pip is very unhappy and angry. He is keenly disappointed by this turn in his life. What he was expecting was that Miss Havisham was going to make him a gentleman, and now what he sees is that this is not going to happen. Look at this text. I was truly wretched and had a strong conviction on me that I should never like Joe's trade. I had liked it once, but once was not now. Guzar gaye wo zamane jab he idealized Joe, when he wanted to be like Joe, when he wanted to work on the forge as Joe worked there. Now he does not like all this. He doesn't want to do the work of a blacksmith. Well, there are some important points to ponder, points to look critically at, especially with reference to the theme of meals. Theme of meals and theme of relationships are interlinked in Dickens' novel. Throughout the novel, Dickens uses meals as a reflection of the relationships. The meal celebrating Pip's apprenticeship is a reminder of the Christmas meal in chapter 4. What we saw there that everybody enjoyed, and Pip was the only victim. Rather, he was a source of fun and ridicule for others. Interestingly, for Pip, both these meals have no sense of enjoyment related to these meals. Why? Because nobody is bothering about him, nobody cares about his feelings. He is dejected, he feels disappointed that his possibility of becoming a gentleman is lost, but people around him are all enjoying themselves. We also need to think about the uneaten meal and cake in Miss Havisham's house that symbolizes the lack of love and human communication and human companionship that stands completely in contrast with what meals commonly signify. Generally, what happens in our social setups is, as human beings in almost every society, meal is symbol of sitting together, family, especially when they dine together or they have their lunch together or they have any meal, sitting together as family members. This is the time when people interact, when companionships are made stronger, when relationships are established and made stronger. But here the case is very different. We also need to look back and think of the first meal that was served in the story. What was the first meal? The pork pie and victuals that Pip gives to the convict. We see nothing as such in terms of companionship with relation to the previous meals that we have discussed on the previous slide, but here we see something different. Though the setting of the meal is unglamorous, it is the cold, damp marshes, and the manner of the guest, that is a convict, they are linked to a dog. There appear to be some genuine hospitality in Pip's words. I'm glad you enjoy it. So this enjoying the food, this reference to enjoying the meal is very, very important. This lays the first foundation of the relationship between Pip and the convict. And the convict answers sincerely, "Thank you, my boy, I do." The meal, in fact, establishes a link between the two. We will find Dickens using food and meals in the upcoming chapters again to enable the reader to reflect on relationships and interactions on various levels of society. An important theme that we notice here through this chapter is the loss of innocence and kindness. The consequence of Pip's intensifying social ambition, his desire for upward mobility, his desire to be a gentleman, is that he loses some of his innocence and becomes detached from his natural, sympathetic kindness. We noticed him to be kind to the convict even in the worst kind of circumstances, and now what we notice is he has lost some part of that kindness. In the early chapters of the novel, Pip sympathized with the convict despite the threat that the man posed to his safety, but now Pip is not ready to sympathize with anybody. Now there is a change. He is unable to sympathize even with Joe, the most caring figure in his life. Another theme is emergence of snobbery. We need to see Pip's response to Estella versus Biddy in this connection. As I have already said, Biddy was interested in Pip. Pip was interested in Estella. And when we look at this triangle, it is very, very interesting to notice that Pip's response towards Biddy and his response towards Estella is very different. Biddy belongs to the lower class. She is beneath the expectations of Pip. And we see that Pip even does not notice Biddy's interest in him. She is only a tool to serve his purposes. She is only a source, a means that he would use to get some education. On the other hand is Estella. And Pip's response towards Estella, his attraction, his liking towards Estella, remembering that Estella belongs to the elite, to the upper class, tells us clearly Pip's desire to upraise, to uplift his social status, and it shows his snobbish attitude towards life as well. This leads us to chapter 14 of part 1. Time passes as Pip begins working in Joe's forge. The boy slowly becomes an adolescent. He hates working as Joe's apprentice, but out of consideration for Joe's goodness, he keeps his feelings to himself and he doesn't tell him anything. Pip, as a narrator, explains his misery to his readers. He's ashamed of his home, he's ashamed of his trade, he's ashamed of his lifestyle, he's ashamed of everything. He wants to be uncommon. He already has told Joe that he wants to be uncommon. He wants to be a gentleman. And interestingly, what happens is neither he can be uncommon nor he can be a gentleman. This is what he realizes. He wants to be a part of the environment that he had a small taste of at Satis house, but that part of life is over for him. He is back from Satis house. He is no more attending Miss Havisham's, and the current status is that he is working at the forge. He fears beyond everything else that Estella will see him in his current dirty blacksmith state. As he works, he thinks he sees Estella's face mocking him in the forge and longs for Satis house. He wants to go to Satis house. Again, he wants to be in the company of Estella, and he is ashamed of his work at the forge. To understand this more, let us read the opening text of chapter 14. It is a most miserable thing to feel ashamed of home. There may be black ingratitude in the thing, and the punishment may be retributive and well deserved, but that is a miserable thing, I can testify. Home had never been a very pleasant place to me because of my sister's temper, but Joe had sanctified it, and I had believed in it. I had believed in the best parlor as a most elegant salon. I had believed in the front door as a mysterious portal of the temple of state, whose solemn opening was attended with the sacrifice of roast fowls. I had believed in the kitchen as a chaste, though not magnificent apartment. I had believed in the forge as the glowing road to manhood and independence. Within a single year, all this was changed. Now it was all coarse and common, and I would not have had Miss Havisham and Estella see it on any account. So the whole perspective of life that he had is completely changed. This is what we notice about Pip. Here is some more text from chapter 14. Since it had seemed to me that when I should at least roll up my shirt sleeves and go into the forge, Joe's prentice, I should be distinguished and happy. Now the reality was in my hold. I only felt that I was dusty with the dust of small coal, and that I had a weight upon my daily remembrance to which the anvil was a feather. There have been occasions in my later life, I suppose as in most lives, when I have felt for a time as if a thick curtain had fallen on all its interest and romance, and to shut me out from everything save dull endurance anymore. Never has that curtain dropped so heavy and blank as when my vain life lay stretched outright before me through the newly entered road of apprenticeship to Joe. I think as a narrator, this mature Pip, when looks back, he is narrating here for us exactly how he felt, and he is, along with telling and narrating all this, critically analyzing this. And this mature narrator Pip, when looks at the experience of the young Pip, now distant in time, very rightly says that as if a curtain had dropped and he could not see the reality of things, and he could not see the newly entered road of apprenticeship to Joe as a straightforward road to go on, to go ahead with life. Rather, it was all a feeling of disgust. The only thing that he could feel was it was dusty with the dust of small coal, as he says. Looking critically at the text related to this chapter, there are some important points to ponder. We need to notice the contradiction and contrast in Pip's shame at having to do honest, hard work with his desire to be a gentleman. And what we notice is that both of these things, they go in contrast with each other. Dickens' criticism is on two levels. One, against the society which enforces and actually reinforces these values. And number two, against the individuals like Pip who adopt society's values despite their better judgment. Pip, who earlier used to dream of being apprenticed by Joe, now dislikes his work. He not only dislikes, he's ashamed of this. And this honest hard work of a blacksmith becomes a mark of shame for him, and this is what Dickens criticizes at. This leads us to chapter 15 of part 1, and what we see in chapter 15 is that Biddy continues to teach Pip all she knows. This shows Biddy's sincerity, by the way. Whatsoever she knows, she is not a miser in teaching that. She teaches everything to Pip. Pip in turn continues to teach Joe everything he has learned, so the cycle continues. Orlick, a man that Joe employs around the forge, begins one day to insult Mrs. Joe within her hearing, and what we notice is that she and Orlick indulge into a quarrel. As Mrs. Joe asks Joe to defend her honor, Joe quickly defeats Orlick in the fight. We are surprised to notice this as readers. This act of bravery on the part of Joe was maybe, as readers, not expected by us, considering the friendly and the kind nature of Joe. But what we understand is when it is the need of the time, Joe has the courage, the rightful courage that is needed. Mrs. Joe is so excited that she faints. However, Joe and Orlick continue to work together as if it is all behind them. They forget all that. It has been almost a year now that Pip is working at the forge. So ab waqt guzarta ja raha hai, Pip is growing up. Now he revisits Miss Havisham at the Satis house. She sees him for a few moments, but only to laugh at him when he looks around for Estella. It is a great disappointment for Pip to know that Estella has been sent abroad to be educated as a lady. Continuing chapter 15, there are a few more important things in the chapter. Disappointed and dejected, he allows Wopsle to take him to Pumblechook's for the evening, where Pip and these two pass their time reading from a play. On the way home, Pip sees Orlick in the shadows and hears guns fire from the prison ships. When he arrives home, he finds that nearly the whole of the village has gathered around his house. Of course, this is very alarming for him. He learns that Mrs. Joe has been attacked, hit over the head and knocked senseless by some unknown assailant, by somebody who has not left maybe any clue. Theme of violence comes in at this point, and when we critically look at what happened in this chapter, we can say that even while Pip dreams of an upper class life, violence and crime continue to be events in his life. In this chapter, Pip is witness to a fight between Orlick and Joe. This reminds us of Pip's fight with a man in the previous chapters that pleased Estella. Violence comes quickly and rather unexpectedly through the novel, as is in this case, does little to solve anything. What we notice is Pip is trying hard and he has a strong desire to move ahead in life, to be socially improved and to have a better social class. But this desire for moving upwards comes in contrast with the impact of the kind of social life that he has at the forge and the kind of family setup that he has around. We also notice that all the violence created and generated by the characters in his social setup is a reminder for him of belonging to a bitter kind of reality that he hates. Well, dear students, there are two more themes that resurface through this chapter, the theme of innocence and guilt. These themes run powerfully through this section as Pip's adolescent mind wavers between right and wrong, between his desire to be good and his stark sense of evil. The play he reads even at Pumblechook's house tells the story of a man whose lover convinces him to kill his uncle for money. So what happens is Dickens, as a master of writing, is foreshadowing what would happen. Soon Pip will abandon, would leave Joe for money and the promise of Estella, and all this is foreshadowed through the happenings in the play. This leads us to chapter 16 of part 1, and what happens in chapter 16 is as follows. Pip immediately suspects Orlick. Though strangely his sister was hit with the shackles that the convict filed off in the first chapter. Because of this connection, Pip also suspects the one-eyed man that Joe and he had met in the pub, and who had demonstrated his own knowledge of Pip's past by stirring his drink with the file that he used to free those same shackles. His sister has suffered from serious brain damage, having lost much of her voice and her hearing as well as her memory. She communicates by writing letters and symbols on a slate. Furthermore, her temper was greatly improved, and she is far more patient towards people and towards Pip now. To help with the household and to take care of Mrs. Joe, Biddy is employed, and she moves into the house and becomes a blessing to the household. Mrs. Joe, who is now unable to talk, begins to draw the letter T on her slate over and over, which, according to Pip, as he guesses, represents a hammer. From this, Biddy deduces that she is referring to Orlick. Orlick is called in to see Mrs. Joe, and Pip expects her to denounce him as her attacker. Instead, she seems eager to please Orlick and often calls for him in subsequent days by drawing a T on her slate. So the confusion whether Orlick was the person who attacked her or not is raised in this chapter. Here is a critical analysis of some important points with reference to this chapter. The seemingly distant episode of Pip helping the convict on the marshes continues to haunt him, even as he tries to distance himself by becoming educated, and he dreams of being Estella's gentleman. The shackles in this chapter, you remember that were cut by the convict that he was having on his leg. They remind Pip of the episode and of the whole event and the shame and the guilt related to that event, that Pip felt like he's partly responsible for his sister's injury. Dickens here subtly changes how we view Mrs. Joe by referring to her now as my sister when Pip addresses or when the grown-up, mature Pip, who is the narrator of the story, tells this. Before the accident, the readers almost forgot the blood relationship between Pip and Mrs. Joe, but with the changing of Mrs. Joe's attitude and temper, her position reverts to Pip's sister. This is the art of characterization for which Dickens is to be appreciated. This brings us to chapter 17 of part 1, and what happens in this chapter is that time passes. Not only Pip is growing in years, but also Biddy is a young woman now. Pip notices that Biddy is turning into a woman, not very pretty but very bright and wise. Pip also tells Biddy his secret regarding his love for Estella. Again, we can notice the selfishness of Pip in this regard. He cannot notice Biddy's love for him, but he is selfish enough to share his secret of his love for Estella with Biddy. He also expresses his desire to be a gentleman. Biddy wisely suggests that becoming a gentleman to gain over a woman who thinks him coarse and uncommon, ये coarse नहीं, ये coarse है, ये A है U की बजाय. You need to correct the spellings for yourselves. This is a typo. So Biddy is very much right, I would say, when she wisely suggests that to become a gentleman for a woman who thinks him coarse and common does not sound very logical. When Biddy advises him to stay away from Estella, Pip is very, very much angry with him. On the other hand, he dislikes it when Orlick pays attention to Biddy. This again shows the developing selfishness in the nature of Pip. He himself is not interested in Biddy. He knows Biddy is interested in him, and yet he is not ready to pay attention to her. And now when Orlick pays attention to Biddy, he does not like this either. And now we come to chapter 18 of part 1. It is the 4th year of Pip's apprenticeship. So quite a few years have passed now. Pip is sitting with Joe and Mr. Wopsle at the pub. As Pip sits there in a crowd listening to Wopsle read the story of a murder trial from a newspaper, a stranger begins questioning about Wopsle, and the stranger asks questions from Wopsle about the legal details of the case. Pip recognizes him as the large, dark man he met on the stairs at Miss Havisham's place in chapter 11. The stranger introduces himself as the lawyer Jaggers, and he goes home with Pip and Joe. There, Jagger explains that Pip now has great expectations. Now, this is in a way the point from where the life of Pip would take a new turn, a very unexpected turn. He has been given a large amount of money to be administered by Jaggers by an anonymous sponsor whom Pip is never to try to discover. Jaggers explains that Pip is to be brought up as a gentleman, and Pip feels his dreams are going to come true. Pip is also told that he will be tutored by Matthew Pocket. Again, this is the man who was referred to at Miss Havisham's place. Pip is also given some money to get new clothes and to get ready to go to London. So the track of the life of Pip is changing now. The prospects of having a gentleman's future again you see bright now. Joe is sad on the idea that he would lose Pip, that Pip would go away. Biddy is also sad. On the other hand, what we see is that Pip adopts a very, very snobbish attitude and thinks himself too good for his surroundings. This snobbish attitude is reflected in his treatment of Biddy and Joe. Still, when Pip sees Joe and Biddy quietly talking together that night, he feels sorry to be leaving them. So what we notice is that he is turning into a snob, he is becoming gradually more and more selfish, yet there is some good left in him. That is why somehow he feels bad about leaving Joe and Biddy when he listens to them talking quietly. This leads us to the critical analysis of what happens in this chapter. I would refer to a very, very important theme here that starts from this chapter, and that would then be carried forward through the rest of the novel. All the story, the interaction of the characters after this would have a strong projection of this theme, that is the theme of misunderstandings. The implication to Pip and to the readers is that Miss Havisham's is the sponsor who is going to make all of Pip's dreams come true. However, times will prove otherwise. Now, because Jaggers is somebody whom Pip has met at Miss Havisham's place, the person who is going to tutor him, who is going to teach him, is yet another man who is associated somehow with Miss Havisham. So all these things give a kind of, I would say, wrong clue to Pip as well as to the reader that maybe Miss Havisham is the benefactor, she is the sponsor of Pip to make him a gentleman by giving him money and to provide him a chance to get education and to improve his manners, etc. However, as the time would pass, we would see how this misunderstanding would lead towards further misunderstandings and how it would affect Pip greatly. Dear students, this brings us to the last chapter of part 1. So this is chapter 19. The word has spread throughout the town that Pip has come into fortune and people are treating him distinctively different. Again, this is a satire on the society where people start treating you differently depending upon how very much wealth you have, what kind of prospects in life do you have. Pip's snobbery is back in the morning. He goes into town to buy clothes for his London trip and stores them at Pumblechook's house because he thinks it would be common of him to wear them in his own neighborhood. It shows his snobbish attitude very clearly. Even Pumblechook is treating him as if he is very special. Please compare and contrast this with Pumblechook's attitude towards Pip throughout the previous chapters. Before he was sent to Miss Havisham's place, when he was sent to Havisham's place for the first time with Pumblechook, and after that whensoever Pumblechook came to their place, that is at Mr. and Mrs. Joe's place. But now his treatment of Pip is very, very different, and this is a bitter satire on people and the society, where the treatment of people depends upon how wealthy they are and how much possibilities of growth in life they have. Relationships between he and Biddy and Joe don't improve. Pip tries to comfort Joe, but his attempt is obviously forced, and Biddy criticizes him for it. When he asks Biddy if she would try and educate Joe so that he could bring him up to another social level once the full extent of Pip's sponsor's fortune is given to him, Biddy says that Joe has no need and does not want to be brought up to another social level. Again, we need to compare and contrast Pip's desire to change his social status and his desire to be raised to another social level, to a higher level, with Joe's and Biddy's no such desire. Biddy clearly and emphatically mentions that Pip, if he wants Joe to get education, this is not possible because Joe is not interested, and he actually is not interested in raising his social status. Another important thing with reference to Pip's this request to Biddy, or his this suggestion, I would say, to Biddy, is that again this shows Pip's selfishness. He wants to do this for a particular purpose. This is for himself. What he wants is, now that he's going to have a fortune, now that he is going to be more educated, it is his snobbish and selfish thinking that makes him feel that to meet up the standards of future Pip, I would say, Joe needs to get some more education. However, since Biddy doesn't agree to that and tells that Joe is not ready for that, Pip is disappointed in that. Pip visits Miss Havisham. She hints subtly that she is his unknown sponsor and does it in such a way that Sarah Pocket, standing nearby, is given to believe it. Finally, Pip leaves for London. Even while he is in the carriage, however, he considers turning around and spending another day saying goodbye to Joe and Biddy. So the good and the evil, I would say, the true nature of Pip and the artificial behavior that he has adopted, we can see a push and pull force working between the two. Sometimes his own selfishness, his own snobbishness comes over, it overcomes, it takes over. Sometimes he is pushed towards his future, but at the same time we see that sometimes he is pulled back, and his true and genuine love for Joe makes him think about him. So here he is thinking of staying for yet another day to say goodbye to Joe and Biddy. Dear students, in this chapter the relationship of Joe, Biddy and Pip is taking yet another direction, yet another dimension. So it is very, very important for us to understand this. We also need to understand how Dickens has used different symbols to convey the upcoming change in the life of Pip. So here is some selected part of the text, that is text from chapter 19, and we would look at the use of the symbol of mist. This is a time when Pip is leaving. But the village was very peaceful and quiet, and the light mists were solemnly rising as if to show me the world. यूं जिस तरह से पर्दा हटा दिया जाता है, gradually किसी stage पर पर्दा ऊपर उठाया जाता है, in the same way the mist was rising above. It was solemnly rising above, gradually, slowly showing Pip the world that he had not seen yet. Symbolically, it refers to the world that he has not seen yet in London, and it is an opening of his journey It is the beginning of a journey that would show him the life, the lifestyle, the kind of world that he has never ever seen before. The text continues, and I had been so innocent and little there, and all beyond was so unknown and great, that in a moment with a strong heave and sob I broke into tears. The innocence that is to be left behind, something unknown and great that is in the future. This is the contrast, and somehow the realization of this contrast affects the heart of Pip so much that he starts weeping. After leaving some part of the text, again I have picked up some important part that I think is important for you to understand. So subdued I was by those tears, and by their breaking out again in the course of the quiet walk, that when I was on the coach and it was clear of the town, I deliberated with an aching heart whether I would not get down when we changed horses and walk back and have another evening at home and a better parting. We changed, and I had not made up my mind, and still reflected for my comfort that it would be quite practicable to get down and walk back when we changed again. And while I was occupied with these deliberations, I would fancy an exact resemblance to Joe in some man coming along the road towards us, and my heart would beat high, as if he could possibly be there. So the genuine love that he has for Joe, now his own selfishness has overcome that, now his own snobbish attitude has taken over. But there is no doubt that Pip and Joe had a strong relationship in the childhood of Pip, and now this is the impact of that relationship that Pip feels like going back. Pip feels like discontinuing his journey, going back home, spending some time with Joe, and then having a better parting. This also, of course, leads towards the theme of guilt. Now that Pip has left, now that he is on the coach, now he is on his way to London, whatsoever he has done to Joe, whatsoever he has done to Biddy, the way he has treated them, the way he has left them there, his snobbish attitude towards them, everything is clear to him, and he feels guilty about that. A very important aspect of Pip's personality is that guilt is always with him. There are things, there are happenings, there are events, there are actions and reactions that keep on making Pip feel guilty. Anyhow, the text continues, we changed again and yet again, it was now too late and too far to go back, and I went on. So the possibility of turning back, of going back to Joe and Biddy is over now. So he says, I went on. And the mists had all solemnly risen now, and the world lay spread before me. The symbol of mist, how it is used. Now all the mist is over. जब धुंध होती है, mist होती है, fog होती है. In the fog, in the mist, you cannot see things clearly. Mist hides things. It covers things. It wraps things up in it. And the result is we cannot have a clear vision. But once it rises above, once it is clear, we can have a clear picture of things. So now Pip has a clear picture of the world ahead, the world that is yet to be discovered, the world that he is going to live in as he reaches London, the world that is yet to be explored by him. This is the end of the first stage of Pip's expectations. Now this sentence is a part of the text. This is where chapter 19 comes to an end, and Dickens writes this sentence as the last sentence of this chapter. This is the end of the first stage of Pip's expectations. So as I said earlier that the novel is divided into three parts, part 1, 2 and 3, and each part shows one stage of the journey of Pip's life. So this part, that is part 1, that has 19 chapters, it comes to an end with this, and we are clearly told that from here the next part of his journey would start. Whatsoever the fears, whatsoever the apprehensions, whatsoever the joys, whatsoever the happiness, whatsoever the innocence, or whatsoever the relationships, the true good relationships with Joe and Biddy, whatsoever the bitter relationship that he had with his sister, everything is going to be left behind. It is leaving the past behind, entering into a new phase of life where new relationships are to be established, new perspectives are to be built, new lifestyle has to be adopted, and a completely new life is to be started. When we look at all this chapter critically, there are a few points to ponder. The first point that I would like to discuss is Pip's vanity. Now that his life is going to be changed, now that he is told that he is going to have a fortune, Pip is more vain than ever before. We need to notice his snobbery. He thinks he is too superior to be in this small village. He thinks he is too superior to other people. His reaction to Joe and Biddy, even his desire to make Joe have some education by Biddy, it shows his snobbery. It is not for Joe's sake, it is not for Biddy's sake, it is for his own sake that he wants it to be done. Another important point that is to be noticed is his enthusiasm to go to London. He gets ready, he gets his dresses stitched, he tries them at the tailor's place, he places them at Pumblechook's place, doesn't bring them to Joe's house. He thinks it's a very common place and he is not supposed to be dressed in an uncommon way. Here the uncommon stands of course for the more sophisticated, the more elite, so he is not supposed to bring them there. This all shows his enthusiasm for going to London to join a new kind of life, and also his snobbery and his vanity. And actually his goodbye to Marshes is a goodbye, we can see it as a goodbye to this phase of life. We would meet a different kind of Pip with different kind of characteristics, with different kind of personality traits in the next phase of his life that he would spend in London. With this we come towards the summary of today's session. Well, in today's session we covered chapter 13 to 19 of the novel Great Expectations. Thus we have ended up part 1 of this session. In this process we explored the text of these chapters. We looked at the text and related different themes to this text. Development of different characters, especially the development in the character of Pip, his enthusiasm to go to London, his desire to leave the place where he spent his early childhood and boyhood, all that was seen. We critically analyzed the selected parts of the text to see the conflicting ideas related to the personality of Pip, how the push and pull forces worked in his personality, his desire to be a member of the elite class in comparison and contrast with his affiliation with Joe and Biddy. All this was examined. We discussed several points related to the development of plot as well, and I told you that part 1 is the end of the first phase of the journey of Pip's life. As we would start part 2 in the next session, inshallah ta'ala, we would see a second part of the journey of Pip's life would start, where we would come across him looking at a world that is completely different from the world he has so far experienced, trying to get settled into that, and being a new kind of a person with different personality traits and characteristics. With this I come to the end of today's session. This is a quick glance of the references of the works consulted and incorporated. Thank you very much.